and welcome to the event this evening, sponsored by the Center for Constitutional Design. We're very, very pleased to see so many people come out to talk about an incredibly important topic in this day and time about the First Amendment, free speech. I'm Stephanie Lindquist. I'm the Senior Director for the Center for Constitutional Design. Most of you who have been to our events know that we are a fairly new center at the law school. Very proud of our current programming, which involves issues such as originalism, the rights of women, free speech, federalism, and election law. We've been covering the gamut of very important topics over the last year. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events and going through this semester. Our website, I think there's in fact, I think on each of the tables is a little card that sets forth our coming events. So please do join us at those, for those as well. This evening, we're incredibly pleased to welcome to the law school perhaps the leading scholar of First Amendment law in the United States today, Robert Post, who is the Sterling Professor of Law at Yale Law School and the former dean there for about, 9 years at Yale Law School. He's going to talk to us today about the misguided free speech principle and the importance of dialogue in our polity today, in our electorate today. Very pleased to have him here. He is going to, his presentation is going to be moderated by our very own Jim Weinstein, who is a great friend of the Center. He's actually a senior advisor at the Center for Constitutional Law. He is, as you all know, also a leading light in First Amendment law in the United States and around the world. And so we're very, very pleased to have Jim with us, too, to moderate this event. I believe that Robert is going to talk for, how many minutes?
40 maybe.
About 40 minutes. And then we'll be sure that we leave time at the end for Q&A, as well as a dialogue between Jim and Robert. So again, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to turn the podium over quickly to the people that you came to see and the person that you came to hear from. Robert.
Thank you, Stephanie. Your glasses. So I want to thank is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. So I want to thank the Center for Constitutional Design. I want to thank Stephanie, and I want to thank Jim, and I want to thank Carol for the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure. I'm going to speak from a little piece that will be coming out in Daedalus, which is the organ of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it's just great to be able to test it out before such an informed and interested audience. It takes a rather radical position, and we'll see what your response is to it. I want to talk about what is known on both the left and the right in the United States today as a crisis in freedom of speech. Everybody seems to think we have a crisis. If you speak out, you get chilled. You're afraid of being canceled by the left, or you're afraid of being bullied by the right. And we don't seem to be able to say to each other what's on our mind anymore. And this causes concern across the whole political spectrum, as well it should. And the question is, how do we analyze this phenomenon of us being unable to talk to each other? And the way in which it's analyzed, I would say, mostly in the press and among commentators, and certainly among law professors, is that it's a crisis in freedom of speech. We say we have a free speech crisis in the United States, and the thesis that I'm going to be arguing tonight, is that that's exactly wrong. It's not a crisis in freedom of speech. It's a crisis in our politics, which has become diseased and dysfunctional, and the recipe for more free speech is exactly the wrong recipe. And so to think hard about the problem that's facing us, we have to diagnose it correctly, and it's that question that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to be taking as my text, when I do so, a recent editorial by the New York Times editorial board. So this comes with the full weight and imprimatur of the New York Times. It was a little piece called "America Has a Free Speech Problem." I bet most of you have read it. And the first sentence sets out the thesis. The first sentence of that editorial says that Americans are losing hold of the fundamental right to speak their minds and voice their opinions in public without fear of being shamed or shunned. So the analysis which the New York Times gives is that we have a free speech problem. What is the cure for this problem? It's to speak more. America should extend to each other the tolerance to speak and say whatever is on their mind. And the implicit premise of that argument was that the more speakers express what is on their minds, the more our politics will heal. That's the thesis of the Times editorial, and that's its proposed solution to our present dislocation of politics. And this framing of the issue, I would say, is pretty typical. It's typical of those who want to defend a free speech principle. And what I'm going to argue is that this depends upon a misguided understanding of a free speech principle. And that whatever the free speech principle means, and of course you all know there's many different accounts of a free speech principle, it cannot mean that more speech is always better. It cannot mean that speech is always to be desired. And if you want to just think about that abstractly for a second, take the limit case. Take the case of somebody that you know, and probably most of you know somebody like this, somebody who can't stop talking. You know, the total narcissist. They just go blurbling on wherever they are, and they can't stop talking, and they talk, and they talk, and they talk. That doesn't add value to much. You say about such a person that they're a narcissist, not that they're exemplifying the free speech value. It may be the case that more speech is better in some circumstances, like maybe in primal scream therapy, what we want is unrestrained speech, but I don't think in any other human situation what we want is unrestrained speech. And normally, people who are well socialized feel constrained to speak discreetly. So I have a friend. I detest my friend's wife. Am I going to blurt it out? No. I'm going to refrain from talking in ways that might hurt his feelings or destroy our friendship. Now, it is the case that all human relationship, all practices occur through speech, right? And what I want to say, and I'm sure you could test this out in your own life, but no friendship could survive if it was purely unrestrained communication. And a communication that did not obey ordinary elemental norms of respect and tact. And what is that saying? That's saying in a friendship, more speech isn't always better. Now, I'm not saying that friendship doesn't, in the appropriate place, require candor and spontaneity. I do need to say what's on my mind if I'm going to have a real friendship with somebody. So how do I know? When do I hold my tongue and restrain and be discreet and tactful? And when do I talk? How do I adjudicate? Because I'm always going to have those two impulses if I'm with a friend. And the answer is, I talk in ways that make our friendship better, and I don't talk in ways that would make our friendship worse. That's how I decide whether to talk or not talk. So what is that saying? What that's saying is what's fundamental is not my speech in the friendship. What's fundamental is the friendship. I speak in ways that make a better friendship, and I refrain from speaking in ways that would destroy my friendship, right? And I would say that same logic applies to every single human relationship in which you partake. We do not, in ordinary life, value speech from the perspective of the speaker, and instead, we value that speech which contributes to the relationship in which the speech is embedded. So consider a lawyer. You know, many of you are training to be lawyers. We don't hire a lawyer to speak and not stop speaking. If you were in court and I couldn't stop speaking, you would say to me, stop speaking now, you know, you're out of turn or whatever. We hire a lawyer not to say whatever's on their mind. We hire a lawyer to better represent the client or to better articulate the law. That's the function of a lawyer. So whenever you're a lawyer, you're always thinking, am I saying the right thing or the wrong thing? That's not to say you can't speak authentically. You have to think and speak creatively, etc. But you have to balance it against the good of being a lawyer, which is better representing your client or whatever. So I'm a professor of law. When I teach my class, do I count the quality of my classes depending on how many words I speak? Am I like Dickens and getting paid by the word? No. I don't do that. I say, am I speaking in a way that will advance education? Will make the class go better, make my students learn more. So I'm always balancing restraint and spontaneity, always balancing more speech and discretion. And I'm balancing it in terms of the good of my relationship to my class. That's to say, the good of education. And so if you think about that, every relationship is going to follow that logic. That's a principle that's going to follow you wherever you go. You're always going to be that balance because you're always engaged in a practice that's going to require both discretion and spontaneity. And that suggests that the premise of the New York Times editorial, that's really familiar to all of you from iteration, probably you've heard it so many times you've stopped thinking about it, that more speech is better, that's just not true. So why might we think it's true? Well, if we talk about freedom of speech as such, we think, well, what is the value of freedom of speech? We tend to isolate speech from social relationships and think of speech in the abstract as something we do like, from Mars, that we're just speaking and we're not actually speaking in the middle of a relationship. And so when we're thinking like that about speech, we tend to think about it in terms of equally abstract value. So one value that people talk about when they talk about why freedom of speech is good is they say, you need the freedom of speech to make knowledge. And that's associated with an idea called the marketplace of ideas. And we say, unless we can talk to each other, we can't have new thoughts, new ideas. And this way of thinking about speech goes back to an opinion, a dissent that Oliver Wendell Holmes writes in November of 1919 in a case called Abrams versus United States, and he invents there the marketplace of ideas. And he said the only way we can get to truth is by putting ideas in the marketplace of ideas, and whatever wins in the marketplace of ideas, meaning people accept it or don't accept it, that's the truth. So this is a very common idea. You could see it in the New York Times editorial, and it tells us in the New York Times, this is Holmes coming down 100 years later. The New York Times editorial says, quote, freedom of speech and expression is vital to human beings' search for truth and knowledge in the world. Now, I bet that's extremely familiar to all of you. But now stop and think for a second and think of any institution that you know of in this country or any country that actually makes knowledge and ask, does it have freedom of speech? Does it work according to the marketplace of ideas? And the answer is no. No organization that actually makes knowledge works according to freedom of speech in that sense. And that's because knowledge is actually knowing something. It's not being accepted by everybody else's opinion. So take an example of universities. Universities exist. The mission statement of Arizona State, for example, increase knowledge in the world. We're the institutions that make knowledge. Do people in universities, do professional scholars simply speak their minds? Say whatever's on their mind? I think such a person wouldn't last very long as a professor. What we professors do when we do research, we speak in ways that are going to be credible, that are going to be persuasive, that's going to have the authority of whatever discipline we're writing in, and so we'll have exactly that same balance that I was talking about before. I have to say what's on my mind, but I have to discipline and restrain such that it meets the standards of whatever discipline I'm writing in. And the fact that it gets accepted in the marketplace of ideas means very little. It means it gets on Wikipedia. But we don't judge the truth of whether there's climate change by what people say on the internet. We judge the truth of whether there's climate change, whether cigarettes cause cancer, pick your topic, by what experts in that topic, people who know the disciplinary standards of truth, say about it. That's how knowledge gets validated. No professional journal works on the marketplace of ideas. Any of you ever submitted an article for publication? No, it's not first come, first serve, right? That's not how we think about it. Nor is it that it's popular. If you wanted something to be popular, you'd be creationist in biology. Now, that's not the test of knowledge. The test of knowledge is people who know the relevant standards of knowledge think that it's knowledge. And that means when you participate in the search for knowledge, you're always engaged in the balance I was telling you before. You're trying to think of your own ideas, but you're also judging them by reference to the criteria of a discipline. And of course, that's not the marketplace of ideas that Holmes describes. Holmes describes one where no one makes any judgment as to truth or falsity. And the way that's reflected in First Amendment doctrine is we say there's an equality of status in the field of ideas. Remember, that's Mosley. Or we say there's no such thing as a false idea for purposes of the First Amendment. That's Gertz. But if there's no such thing as a false idea, there's no such thing as a true idea. There's no knowledge there. If all ideas are equal, there's no knowledge because it's all the same, right? And what we do in the university, we do the opposite of what the court does when it says all ideas are equal. We teach students to discriminate good ideas from bad ideas. That's our function. We call that grades, right? And that's how knowledge is produced. In this dialectical relationship in which freedom of, what you're calling freedom of speech, is only half the story. The other half of the story is evaluation, criticism, sanction, etc. All of those things are true. If you had a professor who simply said what's on their mind, they wouldn't get tenure. They have to say it in a way that's convincing to other people. Okay, so another abstract theory of why we protect freedom of speech that you often see is that it protects individual autonomy. It's often said in the literature we can't be fully ourselves unless we're free to talk. We call that self-fulfillment in the scholarship business, and the influence of this theory is also plain in the New York Times editorial. New York Times says that human beings cannot flourish without the confidence to take risks, pursue ideas, and express thoughts that others might reject. I think it's true. I think any healthy society requires people to be themselves, to be authentic, to express themselves and be creative in the ways that are true to their own ideas. That is an ideal that I think anybody should endorse. And without question, it requires a certain amount of freedom of expression. The question is whether it requires a free speech principle, which is a different thing entirely. It's a different thing entirely because I may want my autonomy and my self-development may be a very good thing, but in our society we say your self-development ends when you start undermining the social practices which we value. So if I'm engaged in just about anything and I'm saying it's me here, I'm autonomous and I'm doing bad things, society says no, it doesn't matter that you're autonomous. So the limits on autonomy are the social practices and the goods in which you're expressing yourself. So again, consider the idea of scholarship. I'm coming back to it because I know it pretty well. So if you get a professor who just simply says what's on their mind, say, it's me talking, and I want to talk, that person's not going to get tenure, that person's not going to get hired, that person won't get their articles published. They can't just, their autonomy ends when the good of the practice of scholarship takes over. And that's true in almost any situation you can think of. Think of professional speech. Think of the speech of a doctor, right? There are doctors who really, sincerely, authentically believe that hydroxychloroquine will cure COVID. But if they recommend that to a patient and the patient is injured, their authenticity, their sincerity is irrelevant. The doctor's autonomy ends at the point of competently practicing medicine. The standard for malpractice is the competent practice of medicine. So the autonomy of the doctor, including the doctor's speech, and if you say doctors do more than speak, think of lawyers who do nothing but talk. The autonomy of the lawyer ends when the lawyer starts acting in ways that are incompetent. End of story. Autonomy doesn't do any work at all. And we can generalize that point because all social practices have boundaries that distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And these boundaries apply to speech as well as to action, and to privilege the autonomy of speakers and to insulate their communication from the enforcement of those boundaries is to undermine the practices themselves. So think about the New York Times editorial board. I am 100% certain, although I have no firsthand evidence, that they don't think of themselves as practicing their autonomy. They say whatever that comes into mind. I don't think the editorial board works that way. They speak in ways designed to reinforce their editorial authority, namely be persuasive. And so they're constantly editing themselves. Anybody who's mature is constantly editing themselves so as to be effective. They don't think about their own autonomy as the beginning and end of their speaking when they publish as an editorial board. Or consider something much more important. Consider what it means to treat other people with respect. Right? We want people to have dignity, but what is dignity? Dignity, for purposes of the law, is when I obey the norms by which we express dignity. So, a simple example is I'm lecturing to you and I'm facing you. That's a social norm that we take for granted. But I could be lecturing like this, and you'd be saying, what's wrong with that person, right? We have these norms by which we relate to each other and by which we mark that the other person I'm talking to is worthy of respect. I teach my kids, don't bite when you go to nursery school. It's not respectful. It doesn't have dignity of the other person. Go sit on the stairs. Now, we ordinarily enforce these norms through forms of social disapproval. I can expect to arouse indignation and condemnation if I go around and spewing shocking and harmful insults. Right? All well-socialized people, everybody in this room knows the difference between talking to somebody and insulting them and abusing them to their face. It's puzzling, therefore. I mean, I want you to understand how deeply puzzling it is that the New York Times editorial board could publish a sentence like this. They say that it's a bad thing that we are losing the fundamental right of speaking our minds without fear of being shamed or shunned. What could that possibly mean? No such right exists in any well-ordered society. If I walk into a room shouting slurs, unacceptable slurs, unjustified slurs, of course I'm going to be shamed. People are going to be outraged. And it would be only a demoralized society that wouldn't shame me. It's appropriate for them to be shamed because as a society, we care that people treat each other with respect. We do that all the time. And if we didn't do that, we would be so alienated from each other. We wouldn't know how to interact with each other. We wouldn't know how to treat each other with respect. Now, it could be that the New York Times editorial board is not concerned really with norms of respect. I don't think any sane person would be. I think maybe they could be concerned with maybe the norms of respect are the wrong norms. You know, people are enforcing the wrong forms of respect. Or they could be making a different point. They could be saying, look, the norms of how you treat people respectfully, think of gender pronouns now, are so much in contest. I don't even know how to treat anyone with respect because these things are changing so fast, and so I'm self-censoring myself. That could be a position they're taking. And those are all positions that are, you know, worthy to be engaged in and talked about and thought through. But notice, none of those are about a free speech principle. Those are about what norms should we have and how clear should they be and where should they be located. That's not a free speech principle discussion. That's a discussion about what are our norms of respect and how we should enforce them. Right? So I hope I've established for you that there's something extremely implausible in a free speech principle stated in the abstract. Normally, when we act in the world all the time, we balance self-restraint against authenticity and against spontaneity. We care about that balance. That's in part what makes us human. And does it follow from what I've just said, therefore, that a century and a half of theorizing about the free speech principle, of which I'm part of that theorizing, does it follow that that was all like a big mistake and we should abandon thinking about a free speech? And I think not. I think that doesn't follow from what I've said. And that's because there's one form of social practice that we have not yet discussed. And that is, I think, of immense relevance to understanding the free speech principle as you see it discussed in these conversations. And the nature of that practice is indicated by a very subtle set of words by the New York Times editorial board when in their editorial they say what they're really concerned with is the right, quote, to speak one's mind in public. In public. Now, that's a seemingly innocuous qualification. But I think it is, although it's very systematically blurry on the point, I think, frankly, that those who invoke the free speech principle actually always have in mind speech in public. So what does it mean to speak in public? What are we talking about when we say this word public? You cannot know anything at all about the First Amendment without knowing that this adjective public is central to almost all First Amendment doctrine. Although it's beginning to lose its salience, but it certainly develops around this notion of the public. The public, say, in classical Greece and in Rome, the public was the people who could assemble within the sound of the human voice in the agora, in the forum. You have an eloquent speaker, and the people who could hear him assembled were the public. That is what the public was for centuries, for millennia. And then something enormous happened to humanity. In the 16th century, the printing press was discovered. Right? And the printing press changed everything because it circulated texts to a number of people who were far more than could gather together in the agora. And it created a new form of social organization, which we call the public sphere. Public sphere develops in the 17th century. And what we now call the public is the thing that emerges in the public sphere. And it's created by texts, newspapers, for example, circulating among strangers, and all of us being in the form of a conversation because we're reading the same text, the same newspaper. And the public sphere and its corresponding idea of the public, remember this public, this idea of what is the public, it's a very odd notion. We anthropomorphize the public. The public is aroused, the public wants to know, the public is angry, the public is curious, right? Almost all judicial opinions anthropomorphize the public in this way. So what is the public, right? And the thing about that public is it's entirely the product of an infrastructure of media, like newspapers or magazines that connect strangers to each other. Now, for us in this room, to speak in public is to speak to people who you don't know, to strangers, and they circulate your text. And in the last couple of decades, the internet has vastly expanded this public. We now have a virtual public sphere which is integrated into our daily lives, and it's a whole new social phenomenon which perhaps we can talk about, but it has created all sorts of issues about communication. So what we call public opinion, think of the word public opinion. Have you thought about public and opinion before? The idea of public opinion is what emerges in the public sphere. It's the putative product of the agent of the public. And the creation of this notion of public opinion, that's a new idea, makes possible new forms of political governance. In the past century or so, it's very common to describe democracy, I'm quoting now from a very famous political theorist, is government by public opinion. In this country, that became clear in the progressive era. It was observed of us in the 19th century by Lord Bryce, but we now think of democracy as government by public opinion. Mike Schutzen, the famous professor of communication, says, the public is the fiction that brings democracy to life. You can't have a democracy unless you have a public. So I'm going to call public discourse. Public discourse is the medium through which modern societies create public opinion. And the idea is to use this public opinion to control the state. So what we now think of as a modern, centralized, powerful state, this emerges in Europe in the 17th century. It emerges because the Reformation had unsettled all forms of authority. There were civil wars. There was conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and they needed a centralized state to create peace. Think here of Hobbes. The central function of the government is to prevent the war of all against all. He's writing during the English Civil War. And these states that were created, these centralized states, were so effective in the 17th century that by the 18th century, the problem was how civil society could control this new Leviathan, this new state, which was able to make peace and enforce peace, but was itself now a threat to them. And during what we now call the Age of Constitutions, during the 18th century, the basic strategy was to find a way to make this new Leviathan accountable to politics. We will use politics to make the state accountable to civil society. That was the project of the late 18th century. So that requires us to think now, what is politics? Hannah Arendt, you might know her, a great political theorist. She says politics, quote, shifts the emphasis from action to speech and to speech as a means of persuasion. To be political is to reach decisions through words and persuasion, not through force and violence. Right? So in the civil wars that accompanied the 17th century, people were killing each other. Now the idea is we differ and we try to reach an accommodation through politics, meaning by talking to each other through this new public sphere, right? And creating a form of public and public opinion, which would subject the state to political control. So the idea is we use this new public sphere to subject the modern Leviathan, created in the 17th century, to the force of communicative politics. Politics meaning we're talking to each other, not killing each other. And nothing like this form of self-governance had ever existed in history before. And my view is that modern efforts to theorize freedom of speech, which is a relatively new thing in the history of humankind, modern efforts to theorize freedom of speech is an effort to theorize this form of political control. It's an effort to theorize the principles which ought to protect this ability to subject the state to political control. And our First Amendment jurisprudence, which I have not been talking about so far, but our jurisprudence of the First Amendment is, I think, best understood as an effort to create the rules by which the public sphere will be protected from political mutilation by the Leviathan, which will always be trying to protect itself from the people. And this was the explicit theme of First Amendment decisions until, say, the 1980s. And the best statement of it that I know of is in Barnett. Justice Robert Jackson in the 1940s, he says, we need a First Amendment that will make sure in this country, quote, that authority is to be controlled by public opinion and not public opinion by authority. That's the project of the First Amendment. And you can see that in the New York Times editorial. New York Times editorial says, I'm quoting now, freedom of speech is the bedrock of democratic self-government. When speech is stifled and when dissenters are shut out of public discourse, a society loses its ability to resolve conflict, and it faces the risk of political violence. Every day in communities across this country, the Times says, Americans must speak to one another freely to refine and improve elements of our social contract. What do we owe to the most vulnerable in our neighborhoods? What conduct should we expect from public servants? And so on. When public discourse in America is narrowed, says the Times, it becomes harder to answer these and the many other urgent questions we face as society. Now, I think that's undoubtedly correct. These are very, very powerful arguments. But note, and this is the key, they're not arguments about freedom of speech. They're arguments about how we have to communicate with each other in order to make our democratic society work, in order to make public opinion control authority. And the basic thought behind what the Times is saying, and I think it's the basic thought behind most First Amendment doctrine, is that if you exclude people from the formation of public opinion, they have no incentive to abide by the rules that the government creates. You know, you didn't let me participate, screw you, I'm not going to follow your rules. You create alienation, you create distance between the people and the government that's supposed to be responsive to them when you don't let them participate in the formation of public opinion. That's not a theory of freedom of speech. That's a theory of how you make democratic politics work. That's a whole different thing, right? We take it in the First Amendment, we call it freedom of speech, but actually it's a theory of democratic legitimation. And if you think about it, the arguments which I was giving you for the abstract theory of speech that don't work on their own, they work pretty well for public discourse. So marketplace of ideas, that doesn't describe how knowledge is made, but it does describe the endless debate which we have to have in order to produce a public opinion that's actually responsive to the people. Because it's endless, because that opinion is always changing as people think new thoughts, as new people start talking, et cetera, et cetera. And if you think about autonomy, that makes a lot of sense too, because in the model I'm giving you, the people who are talking are the sovereigns. They are supposed to be determining the shape of government, not government determining their shape. So the autonomy of the participant in public discourse is an important thing. We think of the citizens as sovereign, as directing the government, not the government as directing the citizens. So it makes a lot of sense if we go back and reverse engineer these theories of freedom of speech. What there actually are theories of this theory of democratic legitimation that I just talked to you about. But nevertheless, this is not a theory of freedom of speech. It's a theory of democratic legitimation. And by focusing on speech rather than the function of the public sphere, the function of freedom of speech in the public sphere, we can be very much misled. Because what I've just said is the practice of public discourse, like every practice that's human, has its point. The point is to make the state democratically legitimate, right? And it's not about everyone talking. It's about creation of democratic legitimacy. Those are two analytically separate things. And the people who theorize that as a freedom of speech, they mistake a means for an end, right? The way in which it's working in the First Amendment is freedom of speech is a means to an end, democratic legitimation. It's not the end itself. The end is that we live in a state that we can call our own, that's democratically responsive to us, in which authority is answerable to public opinion. And now you can begin to see, because these are separate propositions, if you think about it, if you theorize it the way the New York Times does, you can be misled and deeply misled about what's going on in the United States now. So it is normally the case that greater participation in public discourse is associated with greater democratic legitimation. That's why we have the First Amendment. That's why the rules are the way they are. But there can be times when more speech is delegitimating, not legitimating. So a simple example, if all of us come to believe that the very rich control our politics and public opinion is not responsive to us, but responsive to the rich, we've got a crisis. You're not going to see that crisis if you're imagining freedom of speech as every individual talking, because then you're focusing on every individual talking. You're not focusing on the function of public discourse, which is democratic legitimation. This is a fundamental error that the court made in its decision in Citizens United. It didn't understand the why we protect the speech was the issue. It put speech at the forefront. If you put speech at the forefront, it starts to balloon out and lose the very reason why you have the speech in the first place. So what are we saying about this? We're saying that when we participate in public discourse, we have to have a certain amount of freedom of speech, but then we have to balance it against the discretion and tact, which will allow it to achieve its purpose, which is democratic legitimation. And that's the key thing that the New York Times editorial is missing, and that we need to think about if we're going to think hard about how to get out of the crisis that we're in right now. Because for more than a century, Americans have believed that if we talk more, we can heal our political divisions. Our recipe for we're disagreeing with each other is talk more to each other, and you're going to make it work. And that's what the New York Times editorial doubles down on as a strategy. I can't read that. How many times? 10. Oh, I'll finish in 3. Okay. So we'll double down. I've been editing it because I didn't know my time. I was asked to speak for an hour, so I've been editing it down to get it down to 40. I edited too much, sorry. So the New York Times, it doubles down on this idea is the recipe for us being afraid to speak is to speak more speech. And we'll be better if we can all just speak. But an entirely different perspective on our present crisis emerges if public discourse is seen, as I've been advocating for you in the course of this talk, as a distinct social practice, which has its own distinct purpose, which is to create a democratically legitimate public political will, right? The problem of radical polarization, which has become so deep and so rancid that Americans now seem to inhabit different factual and normative universes, that's not a question of speech. That's not a question of a simple speech. It's a corrosive dissolution of the political commitments by which we Americans have made our nation. If we conceptualize public discourse as a social practice, we can see that the failures that we're having now, it's not a problem of speaking more or less. It's not a problem of speaking more freely. It's a problem that we've lost our political will to deal with each other as citizens of a common nation. And I say that because, and I'll defend this in the question and answer, but I'm just going to assert it now, politics, the point of politics is to talk to each other so that we can come to an agreement about what to do. And politics as a practice is possible only by people who think that they're bound by a common fate. It matters that we're all Americans, and America matters more than our disagreement. That sort of thought, the sort of thought that Barry Goldwater had for a long time, right? Unless we have something in common, politics degenerates into a war. I'm going to kill you, I'm going to annihilate you because you disagree with me and because it's a matter of existential survival. And our politics is becoming like that. Think of that famous article, the Flight 93 election, 2016. Michael Anton, the Claremont Institute, said, if we don't take over the plane, we're all dead. That tells you that politics has become existential and that it's more important that we win than that we all together meet whatever fate we Americans are going to meet. Once we lose this common commitment to a shared fate, we cannot have politics. That's what's underlying the polarization. Politics has turned into a war where we want to annihilate the enemy. And that's the problem. But we don't see that as the problem because we're talking speech, talk to each other more. And then somehow polarization will be overcome. Maybe yes, more likely no. Because more speech of the annihilate you kind is not going to help us heal. It's not going to recover what we need to recover if we're going to have the political the political unification that we need that sustains freedom of speech in the first place. We have freedom of speech because we agree that it's important that we all be included. If we don't agree that we're all going to be included, then I don't care what you have to say. Why would I care about that? So the more fundamental thing than the freedom of speech is the common recognition that we're common citizens of a common country. Now, of course, that means that to solve this, we have to address why it is we've lost this sense of common fate. And the New York Times is undoubtedly correct to say whatever kind of political interventions we're going to need to get out of this problem require all of us to participate and to talk and to share with each other what we think. We cannot begin to approach that problem unless we approach it together, because the problem is that we're not together from the first place. But to think about that as an issue of freedom of speech is to say, as the New York Times says, well then talk to each other more and the problem's solved. No, that's not going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem are the political interventions which are going to make the talk constructive and meaningful, which is to say, fulfill the purposes of having a public discourse in the first place. So for centuries, Americans have said, you know, we talk to each other more, we'll heal. But the polarization now is so severe, maybe that's a cruel illusion. Maybe we won't heal if we talk to each other more. More speech of the wrong kind could make it worse. What really we need are political interventions that will ameliorate why it is we've come to distrust each other so much, to mistrust political authority, and to imagine ourselves in a state of tribal war with each other. More speech of the wrong kind could exacerbate rather than heal those divisions, and that's telling me that the underlying issue is not speech, it's politics. And so long as we think about this whole problem through the mythical lens of this free speech principle, we're going to miss the point of how to cure the problem. So it's not innocent that we think about it as a free speech principle. It's less than innocent because it's putting our eye off the ball. The ball is how we heal, how we get together once again. And our democracy at the moment is so fragile, it's so precious, that we can't afford to miss any opportunity to bring us back together again. So I'll leave on that note.
Well, I hope you won't leave on that note. So thank you. I agree with Professor Post that the New York Times editorial, what they identify as a problem is actually, for the most part, a symptom of a disease, of the cause, that they identify a symptom, but the cause is a diseased politics infected by extreme polarization. I agree with that. But, you know, cause and symptom are not always unidirectional. They're not always a simple one-to-one correspondence. Sometimes they're interactive and reinforcing. So I think that there's one aspect. So largely, it's the disease. The free speech problem is caused by the disease politics, but there's one aspect of the free speech problem identified that is, in my view, a cause of the disease politics. So the arrows go both ways. And that is, and I agree, it's not the free speech, it's not more free speech as such, it's not disrespectful speech, it's not, you know, outright lies and conspiracy theories, but what is a part of the cause of the disease polarization is the punishment of heterodox yet responsible ideas, especially on campus and in the workplace. I think this has been causally, if you go back to what has separated and made us as, made 80% of Democrats think that Republicans are an existential threat to the nation and vice versa. Each party thinks a huge percentage, 80-some% of both parties thinks the other party is evil and is an existential threat. One contribution to that, going back, not an insignificant part of it, is what has gone on the American campus and in the American workplace with the, and you know, it's the term of cancel culture, but the punishment of responsible ideas of people who should be able to express these dissenting views. I think that has been part of the cause. Now, I'm not saying that it's, you know, that there it's the large part of it. It's much more complex than that, and I'm not saying that because this has mostly been, of course, by the left on the right, and this has alienated the right, alienated conservative students and conservatives in society, and that adds to the polarization. Now, other things, of course, in the bigger picture that conservatives have done that alienated people on the left, of course, including now we see the empire strike back with some of these censorship of speech by certain governors of Florida and others that I won't mention. But if you look for the root causes, part of it is, I think, particularly on campus and in the workplace, that has caused, to some not insignificant degree, this horrible politics. So that would be my only.
So should I? Should I give it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the interesting thing about free speech is, and thank you for those comments, Jim. I really appreciate it. So the interesting thing about free speech is when you're in a government organization that's designed to do something, anything that you call free speech doesn't exist. So if I'm in a courtroom, it's an organization designed to serve justice. And who speaks and who's compelled to speak and who cannot speak, these are all governed by rules, totally incompatible with public discourse rules, because the idea is the speech should serve justice. And we say, and we talk about, and we organize it according to that. If I'm in the military, same thing. If I'm an employee in a government bureaucracy, right, my speech is governed by the need of the bureaucracy to do what it gets hired to do. And so what we normally call free speech principles don't apply. A school is an organization dedicated to a purpose, just like a bureaucracy. And the purpose is education. And it's for that reason that when we speak about freedom in a school and we're precise, not messy, but precise, we don't talk about freedom of speech. We talk about academic freedom. And just to give you a simple idea of how true that is, when we speak about freedom of speech, you know, First Amendment has many, many, many different rules. But let's just take 3 rules that might define freedom of speech for anybody who wants to think about it in the First Amendment terms. No content discrimination, no viewpoint discrimination. Right? Second is all ideas are equal, no such thing as a false idea. Third, no compelled speech. Every university violates those rules every day, all the time. Like in a classroom, there's content discrimination. I'm hired to teach First Amendment. I don't talk about the Australian Open, you know, I talk about the First Amendment. All ideas being equal, no, I'm there to teach students to think better. Compelled speech, well, let's call that an examination if you're a student, right? You're forced to talk, and that's true for professors, right? Content discrimination, I'm hiring an economist. I'm not hiring somebody who's going to be, you know, talking about Islamic art. Are all ideas equal? No, you don't get tenure if your ideas are bad. Or compelled speech, do you ever hear publish or perish, right? I mean, of course you have to speak. So the rules that you think of as First Amendment, they don't apply at all in a university. Instead, what we do in a university is we regulate speech so as to educate people. It's all coming out of the function of education. One of the functions of education is that we should be able to talk to each other even when we disagree. So I don't disagree with anything that Jim says about, people shouldn't be canceling people on a campus, but not because of free speech, but because that's not how you educate someone. The function of education is to be able to take someone and look at them and deal with them when they're saying something you disagree with and disagree with strongly. That's what we educate people to do, to have the capacity to do that. So the issue isn't everyone talking and everyone should be able to talk. The issue is we should educate each other to understand how to have a conversation with people that we disagree with. I was, Charles Murray, you know him? He came to Middlebury and there was a riot, and actually friends of mine were beaten, suffered concussion in the riot. So I was brought to Middlebury to talk with the faculty and students about academic freedom, and I'm a great person for it. You have to listen, right? You have to have the person. So I'm talking to the students about this, and I'm saying, so why are we educating you? We're educating you so you could listen to, you don't agree with them. That's great. Go up and figure out why and have that conversation. That's the point of an education, to be competent to do that. And they're looking at me, these students at Middlebury College, and they're saying, that's not why we're going to Middlebury. We're going to Middlebury to be qualified to get a good job. Middlebury College for us is a gatekeeper so we can become an accountant or a financial advisor, whatever they wanted to do. And so you're talking about having conversations with people. I don't want conversations with people. I want a good job. I want money. So if that's your idea of education, then of course it's a distraction to have Charles Murray there, and it's very hard to get any argument off the ground about why you should be listening. On the other hand, if the point of an education is as I described, then it is important that you do these things. And so the deep issue within the university, to my mind, is what do we mean by education? What's our function? And it'll follow. The kinds of things that Jim was talking about will follow from that premise. That's the premise that we need to be debating. That's where it makes sense. It does not make sense in the context of a university to debate this under the rubric of freedom of speech.
I agree that the problems on campus and also workplaces have their own purposes that are not Hyde Park. I agree that the free speech rules for Hyde Park for public discourse should not, or do not, and should not govern the university or the workplace. But I also think, and I also agree with you, that speech that is being punished is a betrayal of the educational.
That's the point.
Well, it's still, it's still speech. It is speech that they have been. We're not talking about, the conduct of them, of sexual improprieties or cheating and plagiarism. We're talking about something that is expressing heterodox ideas, and to that extent there's an overlap. But I agree, we basically agree that it's almost maybe semantic. I'm not saying it's free speech. I'm saying that's the problem that the New York Times was, in its clumsy way, trying to identify. Part of that problem is what's going on campus and in workplace. Again, what makes it complicated is some of the stuff that needs to be stopped on campus and in the workplace needs to be stopped so we can progress, because certain types of very disrespectful, outright lies are having their place. Okay, but enough of me. Let's hear from you. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Have you presented your ideas to contemporary political scientists, and if so, what have they?
You're the first. I'm really trying that. This is going to be published in about 9 months. So, and it's a tiny little essay. It's like 20 pages. So I'm anxious for any feedback you have. This is very, Jim and I both cut our teeth. When you did First Amendment scholarship, what you talked about was what's the theory of free speech? Is it autonomy? Is it democracy? Blah, blah, blah. And in this piece, I've decided to use, do you all shave with Occam's razor, really to just get to the bottom of the thing. It's a very radical position.
We have a microphone that we'd like you to, would you please go there and you're first? And then line up on it. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. Could you talk about maybe how the public forum analysis interacts with this? I I think that public forum analysis is kind of a recognition that different rules should apply in different settings.
Yes.
Does that help solve some of these concerns? Are we properly using the public forum analysis?
So public forum analysis, for those of you who don't know it, begins in the 1930s when it used to be said, say, right up until the 1936, 37, 38. When is Hague versus CIO? When is it? Like 38, like in there. It used to be said that the state owned the park, and the state is like the owner of a private house, and if they don't want you in their house, they don't have to let you be in the park and have a demonstration. And the court in the late 1930s begins to hold for the first time, no, the parks belong to everybody, and we're going to call it a public forum. And it used to be said that special rules apply to the public forum that encourage speech more than anybody else. But if you actually look very closely at the doctrine, you'll discover that what governs the public forum are the same rules that would govern speech generally. There's nothing special about the public forum. It is the default position for the freedoms that public discourse should have anywhere, whether they're in Hyde Park or whether they're in the New York Times. And in contrast to that, there are forms of government organizations that have their own control, like within the State House or within a courthouse or within the military, which are not public forum. And these are theorized as the speech which the state cannot regulate is that which is irrelevant to the functional purpose of the institution or organization. That's what public forum doctrine gets you. But it doesn't get you any farther than what should ordinary First Amendment doctrine be.
Could you go to the microphone, please? Thanks. And maybe the next speaker who'd like to speak, maybe line up, just maybe one at a time. Yes, please.
So this is, I suppose, for both of you. Do you think that, beyond what it currently includes, do you think that our free speech doctrine, beyond the state allowing for the free speech of its citizens, should include a protection for the speech of its citizens against undue social influence? And when I say undue social influence, I mean, for example, an employee speaking out of hours and being terminated as a result of that speech, a professor teaching a specific subject and being terminated for that topic. Should it include not just a protection against the traditional heckler's veto, but a more social heckler's veto that leads to excessive consequences for the speaker?
Great question.
You want to go?
No, you go.
Okay. So I don't know what undue social influence means. So I framed it the way you frame it. I can't give you a good answer. I can tell you generically, I see arguments for suppressing speech which silences others. And on the whole, I find that unconvincing because none of us can ever be claimed to be free from the influence of other people. I don't know what it would mean for your speech not to influence me one way or another. And so one is too much. I don't know. I couldn't even begin to think about that question in the abstract. You pose two concrete examples. One example is an employee who gets fired for out-of-work speech. Right? So let me give you my analysis of that situation. I wouldn't put it in terms of undue influence. I would say, what is the government's interest in regulating the speech of an employee? It's that, let's say it's an employee in a bureaucracy, that the bureaucracy work well. And the boundaries of the bureaucracy is going to be determined through a theory of where does that organizational authority stand and where does it run out. A very simple example of that occurs a lot in schools. So no one questions my ability to regulate in a classroom. But if some student outside of the law school, at home or whatever, and I'm regulating in the name of the school, am I really regulating within the organizational domain of the school, or should my special authority over that person run out at a certain point? You see a lot of doctrine about that. You see a lot of doctrine about that in courts. A lawyer in court can be regulated by a judge. A lawyer speaks to the general public outside. The question of what the extent is, the managerial authority of the court outside of the courtroom, is a complicated question. So that's what you're asking. What is the extent of the organizational authority of a government institution outside of, say, working hours or on government property or something like that? And we have lots of situations where it extends beyond, but it's always controversial, and we need to think about that in terms of the functioning of the organization. The second example you gave was a professor who says something controversial. So what I was saying earlier is academic freedom is what governs, typically what governs the capacity of a university to regulate the speech of a professor. And academic freedom goes on the axis, not of the marketplace of ideas, not on what wins in the market, but on the axis of competent, non-competent. So if a professor says something on the outside which draws into question, serious question, the competence of the professor to serve in the organization, that's relevant. If it doesn't do that, the professor should be protected.
Now, your question has another aspect, perhaps, which I think is very interesting. It has to go to what's called the state action doctrine. If you're talking about a government workplace, then the First Amendment applies, and I agree with Professor Post that it has to do with sort of the nexus and the purpose of the managerial sphere. But what about private businesses? Well, the First Amendment as a matter of does not apply, does not keep private businesses from disciplining for employees for off-campus, out-of-works place speech, even if it's just horribly wrong. The First Amendment just has nothing to say about it. Now, the question is, should the First Amendment have something to say about it? In European jurisprudence, there is what's called a horizontal effect, where there is more of that. Or should there be, and a lot of states have state constitutions can be interpreted to apply to private entities like workplaces, or state laws. And those are very hard questions. But I think it's also implicit.
Arizona was one of the first states. It's a pioneering state. Arizona and Connecticut were the first two states in the union to have a statute which protected employee speech outside of context of employment.
Thank you. So if the crisis of cancel culture is not so much a crisis of speech as it is a political problem, my understanding is that Professor Weinstein suggested that the cause of that political polarization might be emerging from, at least a part of it, from campus culture, academic campus culture. Do you agree? How much do you see the role in the university in it?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Sorry?
I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought you
yeah,
did.
and if you do agree, why is it then that the university seems like such a microcosm of our larger problems? And if you don't agree, how is it that the university can influence the political world so strong?
Okay, so I don't think it's primarily, I think universities have become symbolic of this, but I don't think as a causal chain there's some. If you look at that essay, the downing of the Flight 93 election, that's telling you this is way outside anything universities. It has to do with the feeling of certain elements in certain parties that their survival is at stake. That has nothing to do with universities. That has everything to do with how the parties are facing each other, with the ability to compromise. If you look at political scientists, for example, someone asked me about political scientists, and you look at the indices of polarization, they're amazing in the way they've grown in the last. Those are, to me, the critical variables of what's going on in our political scene. On the other hand, universities are symbolic of this, and that's because in the 1960s, universities used to be something called in loco parentis. We used to have the role of parent, and we would govern with an iron fist all of our students, and the free speech movement begins in Berkeley in the early 1960s when Berkeley punishes students who had left Berkeley to go to Mississippi for a freedom summer and committed crimes, and said, oh, you committed crimes in Mississippi during summer vacation, you can't come back to campus. And then the students began to rebel and said, no, we're adults. You can't treat us like you're our parents. We are adults. And at that point, universities in the United States became permeable to the developments of young people. And so people your age create universities, and of course you're emblematic of youth culture throughout the country. So anything that's happening in youth culture is happening in universities, including cancel culture. Not a good thing, and we're very easy targets. What has exacerbated the vulnerability of universities is, along with polarization, has come a form of populism which is anti-expertise. And universities are are the institutions that create expertise in our society. And expertise is it's not innocent. It's a form of authority. It's a form of hierarchy. On the other hand, we as a society can't do without that hierarchy. Our bridges wouldn't stand up. Our airplanes wouldn't fly. Our medicines wouldn't treat us. You couldn't go and get treated for, everything depends on expertise. And where is expertise created? The only institution in our society that validates expertise, gives you the PhD, tells you whether an experiment is true or not true, or actually what we know about the universe, is the university. It is the only institution which creates the disciplinary standards by which, say, if you're a scientist in Xerox PARC, you determine what's true or not true. So universities have this gatekeeping function. And if you're going to be anti-expertise, you're going to be anti-university. And part of what's created the anti-expertise, in my view, this is now my hypothesis, take it for what it's worth, is the internet. So, as I was saying before, if you look at the invention of printing in the 16th century, right? The invention of printing leads directly to the Reformation. It leads directly to people saying, I can read the word of Jesus, so I don't have to obey authority, the priest, the Catholic Church. I know myself. I can be antinomian. I can get God's grace by reading the Gospels by myself. It leads to 2 centuries of war. It's totally unsettling to a society when you undercut the epistemological forms of authority by which a society is governed. And the internet has done that for us. Now everybody and their brother can go to the internet and think they're an expert about anything. So when my sister goes to the doctor, she does her internet research before, and God help the doctor. And I have seen now, I'm alert to this, I've seen in doctors' waiting rooms, I see a sign that says, your Google search is not equivalent to my MD degree. But it is. Sociologically, we are like people who are reading the Gospels for the first time. We think we know everything. That's why this marketplace of ideas thing is really much more pernicious than it seems, because it's taking away the standards by which we actually discriminate junk from protein. And that's a bad thing. It's going to lead to huge forms of unsettlement, and the universities are at the forefront of that.
I was just going to add that, and maybe this is the one point of disagreement with us, when and I haven't done a lot of research about this, when I talk to my conservative friends and students, many of them, most of them, think that the so-called cancel culture is a big part of why they see the other side, the other team, as being an existential threat. So there is more of a connection between the existential.
That's not what they write. I mean, if you look at like the Michael Anton essay, it's about they're going to lead the country right off the cliff of socialism.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's a lot there. Of course, Obamacare was one of the.
Yeah, of course, a Suicide Squad. I mean, that's not cancel culture.
But what I hear from my conservative friends and students is that part of the existential threat is the cancel culture.
But that's because you're a university professor, so of course they're going to take it out on you.
Next, please.
I think you might be right about the internet being the giant human collective of anti-expertise. You can log on and find a number of people that believe communism actually works. It's nuts. My question is this. It seems like both sides, because that's really what our Discord has become. It's become two rather largest echo chambers furthered by the internet. Is one side and the other side refusing to listen in good faith to the ideas of the other. And one side is extremely afraid because what was heterodox yesterday is in question today, and God knows where we're going tomorrow. And the other side, whenever they get fielded, or when they field a question about why did we change this heterodox norm, doesn't really respond in good faith. They cancel the person and call them a bigot. And we've seen it on college campuses. We've seen it in the news, even the pages of the New York Times. During your speech earlier on, you talked about these political interventions that will bring us back. And with one side and the other side at such loggerheads, literally arguing about the very values that we hold and then refusing to listen in good faith to what the other side's values are and holding them to their own side's idea of what the other sides are. Is there a way back? And if there is, what is it?
I'm going to let Jim take that question.
I just identified. No, it's a very important question, and it was Robert just did an interview with Horizon, which this was asked too, and I recommend it when that comes on Horizon. You listen to it. And that's the question. What do we do? And I think part of it is listening respectfully, not declaring disagreement to be evil, to say I profoundly disagree with you, but except when the person is. That's the hard thing, isn't it? Sometimes people will say things that are, horribly, horribly racist, or horribly, horribly just false, but I think we go there too quickly to condemn disagreement as evil, and I think that's the only thing. Just being a professor, that's all I can say is try and not be so quick to condemn, to try and have some charity for the idea.
Another way to think about that question, I mean, I've always thought about it this way, and I think recent events are proving me wrong, but I've always thought that people get together when they have a common problem. That's like from John Dewey. That's American pragmatism, right? And there's evidence of that. If you go to South Florida, you can't say climate change. Climate change doesn't exist, but you can work to change the dikes because everyone understands that the sea might come in. So there's a common problem. If you don't call it the wrong thing that triggers the war, you can work on the problem, right? I would have thought that COVID would have been that. And it proved me entirely incorrect about that. So given that fact, given how deep our ability is to say, actually, to deny that we're facing a common problem, I don't know what to say.
I had the same thought about COVID. One thing it could do, it's done it before, is a war that really is an existential threat to it. I don't mean a Vietnam or a Korea, I mean a World War II. That'll do it, maybe. But I hope we don't have to have that.
I thought there would be more rally around the flag during COVID, and I was surprised when it didn't.
I was shocked. I was totally shocked.
Carol, what do we have? Do we have some more time here? One more? Two more?
How about a lightning round?
A lightning round. All right, real quick. We'll do it in 10 minutes. Carol, can we have 10? Okay, come on. And people go if you need to go, but yes.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much for speaking. I guess my question is along the same lines. In a society where things are getting more and more polarized due to the internet or travel, I'm just wondering, does the issue of having a common enemy or a common goal, does that come from an external factor, or can that come from an internal factor, like just an internal realization through, I don't know, the internet? Well, it's not exactly internal, but more internal than, let's say a 9/11 where everyone can rally around a common enemy, let's say. Do you think that it's more likely there could be an internal reformation, or it really is more likely and probable going to be coming from an external factor where we have a common?
If we had a Great Depression, I don't know whether you're counting that as internal or internal, that could be it was in the 1930s, country was highly polarized in the 20s. It was so highly polarized over issues like prohibition. You may not know this, but there was the one and only time that Congress didn't reapportion itself based on the census was 1920. And that's because the census would have given more power to urbanites for the first time, than to people who lived in rural areas. And that would have meant it gave more power to wets than to dries. That's how deeply polarized the 1920s were. It takes the Great Depression to bring the country together. Now, I don't know whether it would today or whether we'd eat ourselves alive. I don't know anymore.
Thank you. So my question was, when you were discussing the marketplace idea of ideas and public discourse earlier, I was wondering, because it feels almost as if there are simultaneously two different marketplaces and two different streams of discourse, right? We've got, the left or the right, or, however you want to segregate what feels like two extreme populations these days. And I was wondering, how do we get away from this feeling of instant gratification where everyone is saying what you were saying, which is that misguided idea of just everyone talking at once and trying to get what's on their chest off their chest? How do we move away from that instant gratification idea and then move towards one public discourse where it feels as though people are self-censoring and people are trying to put productive ideas forth? Because it feels that we've gotten so far away from that I wonder how we can get back there.
It's a deep, deep question. Here's another thing to think about. You all know The Protestant Ethic by Max Weber. You know that? So how do you make capital development? You discipline yourself. You don't do what you want to do. Desire is the enemy. You accumulate capital by not spending. Right? The culture in the United States changed fundamentally during World War II when we moved to a Keynesian economy, which means demand-centered. So we make the economy go more when consumers spend more. What's a consumer? The opposite of Weberian self-discipline, right? Consumers need to go to act from their desire, from what they want. So I would say the kind of behavior you're describing, where everyone just wants to, speak themselves, this is very similar to postmodernism. It's very similar to people who live without a self-discipline. And why is that? Because the centerpiece of American economy since the World War II has been consumerism. And the consumer is someone who gratifies desires, and that's what we teach people really to be. And if we teach people to be consumers and they act like consumers, I think in the end, politics is going to be impossible because we're going to end up where we're ending up. This is a big problem. And that's what education is supposed to counter, but it's very hard. If you look at the big war in education in the United States now, talk about in the universities, it's between the university as teaching students something that we have to teach and the universities being responsive to students as consumers. And we are moving ineluctably down the second path, and the more we do, the more we reinforce the trend you're talking about, in my view.
One more quick question and one more quick answer.
I know it was asked, kind of loaded a little earlier, but do you really not have any political, just lost my train of thought, sorry. Basically, what would you advocate for to make those changes, given that we're not focusing on speech, but the politics that has soured?
I don't know. All I want to say is you can't get an answer until you ask the right question. You ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. You ask the right question, you're on the path. That's all I can do at this point. I mean, I have research agendas where I'm trying to think about ways in which we can do, but nothing ready yet that I would have any confidence in saying.
Second journal article, it sounds like.
Not a second, no.
Yeah, a couple of ideas came out of the things that we could do, but we don't know. We're betraying what they used to tell us in the 60s. We're the same as we were. They used to say, no problems without solutions. We're children in the 60s. We identified problems, but not, no. But I think you gave a couple things, and I tried to as well. And with that, let's thank Professor Post and turn it back over to Director Lindsay.
Incredibly interesting conversation between you and Jim, and your presentation was amazingly insightful. So we really do appreciate you being here. I want to thank everybody for all the excellent questions from the students and the audience, and for your willingness to be here as well. I have to thank Carol McNamara in the back, who is the genius behind all of our events. And we also want to thank you here now. Stephanie Escobar, who you might have met out at the table where you signed in, is new to the center, so if you have a chance to welcome her to ASU, I'd be grateful. And I just want to also point out to you that on the card that's on your table, next Wednesday we have three scholars coming here from Mexico, from some of the leading universities in Mexico, to talk about constitutional change and crisis in Mexico. And given how close we are to our neighbor to the south, I think this will be a very, very illuminating conversation with them. And it is also on a reception following the same format on Wednesday evening. So I do encourage you to come to greet these incredible scholars from Mexico. Again, thank you to Jim, and thank you to Robert.
And I have one more advertisement that a week from this weekend, at February 23rd and 24th, I believe it is, Peter DeMarnoff here and I helped the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership put on a conference which is going to be on the Tempe campus, a Friday and a Saturday, and you can look it up under schedule. It's going to be on ideological conformity on campus and in American society. So with that advertisement, I'll say good night.